The smoke rose from the hillside every morning that winter, thin and gray, against the Montana sky, barely more than a whisper against the cold. The people of Ridgewood saw it from their windows. They pointed at it from their porches. They laughed about it at the general store, trading theories over tobacco and coffee, while the stove crackled and the January wind pressed its face against the glass. Ghost smoke, someone called it. The breath of the earth itself, said another. Hector Drummond, the man who ran the town, the way a fist runs a table, had sent search parties up that hillside 3 times. 12 men on horseback walking every inch of frozen ground, finding nothing but dead grass and rock, and that impossible thread of smoke rising from nowhere. He had told the town, standing behind his counter, with the certainty of a man who had never once been wrong in his own estimation, those sweetest children are dead, frozen somewhere on the prairie. The smoke is a natural phenomenon, gas escaping from the ground, nothing more. But Hector Drummond was wrong. He just did not know it yet. And the price of that wrongness, when it finally came due, would be paid in a currency he never expected to spend. To understand what really rose from that hillside, you have to go back 18 months. Back to a September morning that started ordinary and ended with everything broken. Back to a family that had built something real on this unforgiving land, and a woman who looked at what they built and saw only what she could take. Back to the morning Lars Voss taught his son how to hang a door. The workshop behind the Voss homestead smelled of pine resin and sawdust and the particular warmth of a wood stove that had been burning since before sunup. Lars stood behind Eric, his large hands guiding the boy's smaller ones around the brace, showing him how to feel for the true vertical before committing the screw. Eric was 15, lean and serious in the way of boys who observe more than they speak, and he held himself very still when his father guided him, absorbing the lesson not just through his mind, but through his hands. In the kitchen 20 feet away, Marta Voss listened to the rhythm of their work without needing to see it. The pause before the screw turned. The small sound of approval her father made when the angle was right. She was 17 years old, and she had been reading the language of that workshop her entire life, the way you learn to read weather or the mood of a river. She knew exactly what was happening out there without looking up from the stove. This was the world as it was supposed to be. Lars Voss had brought his children from Sweden when Marta was 8 years old, crossing an ocean and half a continent to reach this particular patch of Montana prairie. He had built the homestead with his own hands on land his father had claimed before him, 30 acres on the eastern slope of Ridgewood territory that the family had worked for going on 2 decades. He was not a wealthy man. He was something rare in that country, in that time a careful man. A man who taught his children to read weather in the color of the sky, to find water by watching where animals gathered at dusk, to carry the old knowledge from the old country alongside whatever the new world offered. He had also been, as careful men sometimes are, a poor judge of certain kinds of cleverness. Rowena had come into their lives 14 months before that September morning, arriving in Ridgewood with a widow's history and a smile that Lars found warm, and his children found unsettling in ways they could not immediately name. Eric had been the one to first put language to it. He told Marta one evening while they were feeding the horses, speaking quietly so the words would not carry to the house, "She looks at things the wrong way. She looks at the table in the parlor like she is counting what it would fetch at auction. She asks about the acreage like she is measuring something." Marta had told him he was imagining things. Lars was happy, and Lars's happiness was not nothing after 5 years of managing without a mother. She would later understand that Eric had been right, and that understanding would cost her everything before it gave her anything back. The morning Lars' horse threw him, the sky was the particular clean blue of early September before the first frost comes. He was riding back from town, taking the lower trail along the creek, when the animal shied at a rattlesnake sunning itself on a flat rock. Lars went over the horse's shoulder and met a granite boulder with the side of his head. He was alive when the horse came home without him. He was alive when they found him on the trail. He was alive for 3 more days, his chest rising and falling with steady mechanical persistence, while his mind stayed somewhere none of them could reach. Marta did not leave his bedside for those 3 days. She held his hand and talked to him about the small things of daily life, the garden coming in late, the way Garm had finally learned not to chase the chickens, the repair Eric had nearly finished on the barn door. She told him these things because she did not know what else to do, and because somewhere in her she believed that the sound of her voice was a rope he could follow back if he chose to. Rowena sat on the other side of the bed with her hands folded in her lap, patient, in the way of someone who is waiting for something specific. On the morning of the third day, Lars Voss stopped breathing. They buried him on the hill above the homestead, next to the flat stone that marked where his wife had been remembered, though her body lay at the bottom of the Atlantic. The crossing from Sweden had taken that, among other things. Eric stood at the edge of the grave in the September sun and did not cry. He did not speak. He looked at the hole in the earth, and then when they began filling it, he turned and started walking back toward the house. And Marta watched him counting his steps. She could see his lips moving, 17 steps from the grave to the back porch. He counted them twice as if he needed to be certain of the distance. She did not know then that he would count those steps again and again in the months ahead, in the silent hours when he could not find another way to hold himself together. 3 days after the funeral, Rowena revealed what she was. Marta was at the kitchen stove when she heard the footsteps in the doorway, deliberate and unhurried. She turned to find her stepmother standing with a folded document held loosely in one hand, the way you hold something you have already decided how to use. The pretense was gone. That was the first thing Marta noticed. The warmth Rowena had maintained so carefully for 14 months had simply evaporated the way morning frost burns off when the sun finally means business. What remained underneath was something cold and entirely certain of itself. This homestead is mine now. Rowena's voice carried no heat and no hesitation. The law is clear on what a widow inherits. You are not my children. You are not my responsibility. I want you gone by sundown. Marta set down the wooden spoon she was holding. She felt the words land, felt the particular quality of shock that comes not from surprise but from confirmation of something you hoped you were wrong about. This land came from our grandfather, she said. Her voice was steady despite the cold spreading through her chest. Father inherited it. There are papers in the county record. Rowena smiled then, and the smile was the worst thing Marta had seen on a human face in her 17 years. Your father was unconscious for 3 days before he died. 3 days is quite a long time. Long enough for a man at the edge of death to be guided through the signing of a new document. Long enough for that document to be witnessed by Edmund Price, who is a licensed attorney and who owes me certain considerations. She held out the paper. At the bottom, a signature crawled across the page in the trembling hand of a man who had not known what he was signing, or had not known anything at all. Marta looked at it without touching it. She had been in that room for every hour of those 3 days. She had watched her father breathe. She had held his hand. He had not opened his eyes once. That is a forgery. She said it quietly and meant it without drama, stating a fact the way you state the temperature or the direction of the wind. Rowena's hand moved faster than Marta anticipated. The slap hit her cheek hard enough to send her stumbling against the edge of the stove, and before she could recover, she heard the sound of Eric being shoved off the porch, a short surprised grunt, and then the soft thud of a body meeting frozen ground. Garm came from wherever he had been sleeping, with his hackles raised and his teeth showing, placing himself between the woman and the doorway, with a sound in his chest that was not entirely a dog sound. He was 2 years old and not small, the gray coat of his wolf grandmother thick across his shoulders, and he did not move. Rowena picked up a stone from beside the porch steps. Take that animal and get off my land before I send for the sheriff. Both of you. Now. The stone caught Garm on the shoulder, and he yelped but held his ground. He stood there looking at Rowena until Marta called him to her side, because she had understood in the moment of that slap that there was no winning here today. Not with a forged document and a lawyer's signature. Not at 17 in a county where no one would take her word against a widow and a licensed attorney. She helped Eric up from the dirt. His nose was bleeding slightly and his eyes were dry. He dusted off his pants with the focused attention of someone who needs something to do with his hands. We are leaving, Marta told him. She turned and walked away from the homestead. She did not let herself look back for the first 30 steps. When she finally did look, she was not looking at the house from sentiment. She was memorizing. The brace on the barn door that Eric had repaired. The kitchen garden her mother had planned from a description in a letter before she ever saw the land. The window in the workshop where the morning light came in at an angle that lit the dust in the air, like something from a painting. These things were hers in a way no document could alter. She pressed them into memory the way you press a hand into clay, making an impression that holds. Then she turned back toward the road and did not look again. The town of Ridgewood had watched the Voss family for 3 years. They had seen Lars build and plant and trade. They had nodded to him at Sunday services and done business with him at the general store. Some had called him friend in the easy way of people who mean it fair weather but have not tested it in worse conditions. Now they watched his children walk into town with nothing, and the testing came and nearly every one of them failed it. The church was the first place Marta tried. It sat at the center of Ridgewood with its whitewashed walls and its pointed steeple, looking exactly like what a church should look like, which she would come to understand was not necessarily the same thing as being what a church should be. Reverend Samuel Aldrich was preparing Sunday's sermon when she appeared in the doorway. He was a tall man with a long face and eyes that seemed perpetually focused on something just past whoever stood before him, as if the real conversation was always happening slightly to one side of the visible one. She explained their situation plainly. Their stepmother had taken the homestead through a document that could not possibly be legitimate. They had nowhere to sleep. Perhaps the church could shelter them while they found a path forward. Aldrich studied her for a long moment with those slightly displaced eyes. Then he said a dutiful daughter does not quarrel with her mother. Perhaps this difficulty is a lesson the Lord intends for you to receive. Return home and submit to her authority as Scripture requires. She is not our mother, Eric said from behind Marta, and the anger had cracked through his silence like water finding a fault in stone. She forged our father's signature while he was unconscious. She stole our home. Aldrich's expression settled into something harder. I will not provide shelter to children who speak against their elders. You may go. In the back corner of the church, Marta noticed a young man a few years older than her, not yet 20, standing very still among the shadows near the vestry door. Nathan Aldrich, the reverend's son, watching them with an expression she could not quite read. Not hostile, not mocking. Something more complicated than either of those things. She filed it away without understanding why. From the church, they went to the general store. Hector Drummond was the kind of man who had decided somewhere in his 40s that certainty was the same thing as wisdom. He was 55 years old, thick through the shoulders, with a gray beard he kept trimmed precisely, and the bearing of a man accustomed to being the last word on any subject. He had built his position in Ridgewood over 30 years through a combination of genuine competence and the particular talent some men have for making their opinions sound like facts. When Marta finished explaining what had happened, he laughed. He laughed loud enough that everyone in the store heard it. Martha Prescott, buying flour, heard it. Vernon Calder, examining axe handles, heard it. The cluster of young men near the tobacco heard it, including Boyd Reardon, who had his father's money and his father's capacity for casual cruelty, and who grinned at the sound the way a dog grins at the smell of something dead. Those Swedish children will not see November Hector announced to the room as if rendering a verdict from a bench. Look at them. They cannot keep their own family from throwing them out, and now they want charity from decent people. He leaned across the counter until she could smell the tobacco and coffee on his breath. I do not shelter vagrants. I do not hire children who cannot manage their own affairs. Get out of my store before I have Boyd here show you the door. Boyd cracked his knuckles with the particular enthusiasm of someone hoping to be given a reason. Marta did not give him one. She took her brother's hand and walked out with her back straight and Garm at her heel, and she heard the conversation resume behind her before the door had fully closed. Martha Prescott's voice, carrying to 2 women on the boardwalk outside the Voss girl, has been cast out, you know. There must be a reason. You know how those Swedish families are. Strange customs. By the time the sun touched the western ridgeline, every door in Ridgewood was closed to them. They walked east, out of town in the cooling September air, and Eric had not spoken since the church. He walked with his eyes forward and his hands in his pockets, and after a while he said without turning his head, he was afraid of us. Marta glanced at her brother, Hector Drummond. Eric nodded once. He looked at us the way people look at something they do not understand and cannot control. He was not just being mean. He was afraid of something we represent. What do we represent, she asked. Eric was quiet for a moment. Something he does not know. Something outside the edges of what he knows. He hates that. Marta had no answer for this. She stored it the way she had stored the image of the homestead, not knowing yet what she would eventually do with it. 6 miles east of town in a cabin so small, it was barely a definition of the word. A fire burned in a stone hearth, and an old man sat beside it and waited. Arvid Voss was 74 years old. His hands were twisted with the arthritis that comes from decades in cold, wet places, his lungs carrying the scar tissue of 30 years in Swedish iron mines. He had come to America following his son Lars, following the idea that somewhere on this continent there was land where a man could work without giving half his strength and all his dignity to someone else's profit. He had helped Lars build the first structures on the homestead. He had taught his son everything he knew about reading, weather reading, soil reading, the particular silence that falls before a storm. And then they had quarreled, as fathers and sons sometimes do, over the question of how a man should build. Lars wanted American houses, frame construction, shingled roofs, wood stoves that threw heat in all directions and consumed fuel like something that did not understand the meaning of winter. He said the old ways were old. He said they were in America now. Arvid had called him a fool, not gently. Neither of them had apologized. And then Lars was dead, and the argument could not be resolved in any of the ordinary ways, and Arvid sat alone in his small cabin with his arthritic hands and his scarred lungs and the weight of a quarrel that had outlasted one of the people who'd had it. He heard Garm's bark in the darkness sometime after 9 o'clock. Not an alarm bark. The bark of a dog announcing arrival to someone expected. Arvid rose from his chair, joints protesting each step, and opened the door. Marta stood in the entrance with Eric beside her. Both of them were carrying the particular quality of exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from a day that has taken too much. Behind them, the September dark had turned cold enough that their breath showed. Arvid looked at his grandchildren for a long moment. Then he said, come in, and sit down and let me tell you what we are going to do. He fed them first. He always fed people, for he talked to them about serious things, a habit from the old country where you did not ask anything of a hungry man that you did not have to. While they ate, he moved around the small cabin with the careful economy of someone who had learned to make every motion count, and he did not speak of anything more pressing than the food and the fire. When the bowls were empty, he sat back down in his chair and looked at them across the low table. There is land, he said, 30 acres on the eastern slope of Ridgewood Hill. Your father never filed the claim because he thought it was worthless. Just slope and grass, he said. Nothing you could build on, nothing worth the trouble. He reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a folded piece of paper, weathered along the creases from handling. He had been carrying it for a while. He spread it on the table, a hand-drawn map precise in the way of someone who had learned to make maps before the tools for making them were readily available. Rowena does not know about this land, Arvid said. No one in Ridgewood knows. It is unclaimed. It is ours if we act before the winter closes in. Marta looked at the map, then at her grandfather. How do we build something no one can find? We have no money. We have no tools beyond what we can carry. The ground will be frozen in 6 weeks. Arvid picked up a stick and leaned forward, drawing in the ash at the edge of the hearth, the way he had drawn things for Lars when Lars was young and willing to listen. In Sweden, he said we called it Jord Keller, a house built not on the earth but inside it. Our ancestors learned this long before any of us were born because they had to. Because the winters they survived and would kill everyone in this soft American town, and they survived them by understanding one thing that this country has forgotten. He drew a hillside in the ash, then a chamber carved into its face. The earth holds heat, he said, not the heat of fire and not the heat of summer, something older than both. At a certain depth, 15 feet down, the ground maintains a constant temperature regardless of what the air above it does. 54 degrees year in and year out. Does not matter if it is 40 below outside. The earth below 15 feet has not gotten the news. He drew the entrance angled to catch the winter sun. He drew the narrow chimney pipe, explaining how 3 inches of diameter creates a draft strong enough to pull smoke up efficiently while producing barely a visible trace against the sky. He explained the south-facing entrance precise to 15 degrees to catch the low December sun for 2 hours each day, enough passive warmth to reduce fuel consumption significantly. He said all of it once completely with the patience of a man who knows he is passing something down and wants to do it right. Eric had been listening with his eyes on the ash drawings, and now he looked up. He spoke not with doubt, but with the directness of someone doing actual calculation. We would be living like animals, underground, in a hole. Arvid looked at his grandson without offense. Your father built a fine American house with a frame roof and a big iron stove. He paused. Where is your father now? Eric was quiet. The people in that town will call you animals, Arvid continued. They will call your home a grave. They will say you are living like something less than human. He met the boy's eyes steadily. Let them. What matters is whether you are warm in February. Marta was watching her brother. She saw the moment the resistance shifted into something else, not agreement exactly, but the decision to reserve judgment until the evidence was in. Eric looked back at the ash drawings for a long moment. Then he said the angle of the entrance. At this latitude, 15 degrees would capture approximately 2 more hours of direct sunlight than a standard horizontal entry. I can improve that by another 12 minutes if we account for the shadow line from the ridge above. Arvid looked at his grandson with an expression Marta had never seen on the old man's face before. He said, yes, you can. It was the first time all day that anything had moved in a direction other than loss. Outside the cabin, the September dark had settled in, fully stars, thick above the Montana prairie. The first real chill of the coming season moving down from the north. Arvid went to the window and stood looking out at nothing visible. His voice when he spoke again was quieter than before. The kind of quiet that is not about volume. I have been watching the weather for 50 years, he said. I know its signs the way I know the shape of my own hands. He paused. There is something coming this winter. Not an ordinary winter. The birds move south 3 weeks early. The animals are putting on weight in ways I have not seen since 1862. He turned from the window. The kind of winter that comes once in a generation. The kind that kills not the weak ones, but everyone who was not ready for it. Marta looked at the map on the table, at the careful ash drawings in the hearth, at her grandfather's twisted hands and the certainty in his eyes. When she asked, Arvid was quiet for a long moment. I do not know, he said. That is why we start tomorrow. The first morning, the smoke rose from the hillside. A child saw it. He was 8 years old, standing on the boardwalk outside his mother's shop in Ridgewood, while she unlocked the door, and he pointed at the eastern slope and asked if ghosts needed to cook their breakfast. His mother told him to stop being foolish. But she looked. They all looked eventually, and what they saw was a thread of gray so thin it might have been mist rising from a hillside that contained, as far as anyone in Ridgewood was concerned, nothing but dead grass and frozen rock. By the time Marta and Eric had been underground for 3 weeks, the smoke had become the town's favorite mystery. Men debated it at the general store the way they debated the price of cattle or the reliability of the railroad. Natural gas escaping from a fissure in the rock, an underground coal seam catching heat from somewhere. One old-timer suggested the earth itself was dreaming. None of them considered the simplest explanation, which was that 2 people they had decided were dead were instead warm and fed and listening to every word. The work of those first weeks had been brutal in the specific way that meaningful things are brutal, not random suffering, but effort with a shape to it, pain that was building towards something. Eric swung the pickaxe from first light until his arms stopped responding to instruction, then wrapped his blistered hands and swung it again the next morning. Marta hauled the excavated earth away on a wooden sled garm in the traces beside her, the dog having appointed himself to this task without being asked and performing it with the steady reliability that was his fundamental nature. Arvid supervised from a chair they carried to the site each morning, his body too compromised for the physical work, but his mind as precise as it had ever been. He watched the angle of every wall and called corrections before mistakes could compound. He showed Eric how to cut sod blocks that would interlock without mortar. He explained the drainage angle for the entrance passage so that spring melt would run away from the structure rather than into it. He said these things once each and did not repeat himself, which was the habit of a man who trusted the people he was teaching. What Marta noticed in those first weeks was her brother changing. Eric had always been the quiet one, the observer, the boy who processed the world through his hands and his measurements before he processed it through words. But something was happening to him in that excavation that she had not anticipated. On the third day, he suggested the modification to the entrance angle he had mentioned in Arvid's cabin, and when Arvid confirmed the math was sound, something shifted in Eric's posture. Subtle like a door opening an inch rather than swinging wide, but she saw it. He started making decisions without waiting to be told. He began to take ownership of problems before they became problems. When a section of wall showed signs of instability, he had already calculated the solution before Marta had finished identifying the concern. Arvid watched this happen with the expression of a man seeing something confirmed that he had long suspected. By the end of October, they had a roof. By the first week of November, the smoke was rising every morning. It was Vernon Calder who came first. He was the town's carpenter and builder, a man who had constructed half the structures in Ridgewood over 20 years, and he arrived on horseback on a Wednesday afternoon with the confidence of someone who has never encountered a construction problem he could not identify and explain. He had heard about the disturbed earth on the eastern slope and ridden out with the stated purpose of confirming what he already believed, that two inexperienced children had dug themselves a hole that would collapse before Christmas. He found the disturbed soil easily. Fresh mounds of excavated earthgrass, torn back in patches, the clear evidence of recent significant digging. He dismounted and walked the area with professional attention, tapping the ground with a long stick he carried, listening for the hollow sound that would tell him where the void was. He stood directly on the roof of the main chamber for nearly 4 minutes. The sound he heard was solid, compacted. He tapped it 3 times in different spots and heard nothing that concerned him. He did not know that Eric had calculated the load-bearing thickness to exceed the weight of 2 mounted horses, because Eric had understood from the beginning that people would walk on this roof and had built accordingly. Below in the chamber, the 3 of them were absolutely still. Marta had heard the horse first, then the footsteps, and she had put her hand on Garm's back before he could react. The dog understood the instruction and lay flat, his ears pressed back, his eyes tracking sounds his humans could not fully hear. Eric sat against the far wall with his hands on his knees. Arvid had not moved from his sleeping platform. Above them, Vernon tapped the ground one more time, muttered something they could not make out, and walked away. That evening at Hector Drummond's store, Vernon delivered his verdict to whoever was listening. The Voss children had dug themselves a grave, and when it collapsed, they would be buried in it, and that would be the end of the matter. Boyd Reardon thought this was funny. Hector Drummond nodded once, his expression carrying the particular quality of a man who has said something publicly and is not yet ready to revisit it. He did not issue another proclamation. He simply nodded, and Marta, if she had been there to see, it would have recognized what Eric had identified on the road out of town. Not conviction, something closer to a man trying to convince himself. November settled over Montana with cold that had intentions. Inside the dugout, life organized itself into a rhythm that surprised Marta with its completeness. The temperature held steady regardless of what the wind was doing outside, which she knew intellectually from Arvid's explanation, but experienced as a daily small wonder. She rose before dawn to tend the stove. Eric hunted in the early morning hours when the light was good, moving through the frozen landscape with a patience and silence that the prairie seemed to recognize and accept. He brought back rabbits and prairie chickens with a regularity that spoke to an attention he had developed quietly without announcement. Arvid's cough worsened in November. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but with the steady incremental progression of something that has been building for years and is running out of time to hide. Marta heard it in the night and said nothing. Arvid heard her not saying anything and said nothing in return. They had arrived at an understanding that did not require language. It was in the middle of November that Nathan Aldrich appeared at the entrance. Marta was outside gathering wood from the cache she had built among the rocks, when she heard boots crunching through the frozen grass and pressed herself against the stone, one hand moving to the knife at her belt, before she had consciously decided to reach for it. She had been ready for this moment in the way you are ready for something you hope will not come, all preparation and no desire to use it. The figure that came around the fold in the rock was not Boyd Reardon. Nathan Aldrich was 19 years old, wearing a coat that fit well enough to indicate family money, with the kind of face that carries its interior weather visibly. He stopped when he saw her. His hands were at his sides open, and his expression was not the expression of someone who had come to cause trouble. It was the expression of someone who has been carrying something for a while and had decided finally to set it down. "I have known you were here for almost 3 weeks," he said. He did not try to soften this or frame it carefully. "I followed the smoke one morning before the wind came up. I kept my distance and watched, and then I went back to town, and I have not said anything to anyone." Marta's hand stayed near the knife. "Then why are you here now?" Nathan reached into his coat and produced a small wrapped bundle, window glass, 2 panes carefully packed. "I thought you might want the light." She looked at the bundle and did not take it immediately. She was trying to read him, trying to understand what currency he expected in return, because everything she had been offered in the past 2 months had come with a cost she was expected to absorb. He seemed to understand what she was doing. "My mother died 3 winters ago," he said. "Pneumonia. She was sick for 2 weeks, and every day my father told himself he would sit with her when he had finished his other obligations." He met Marta's eyes steadily. She died calling for him. He was delivering a sermon on Christian charity to the ladies' auxiliary. The silence between them had a different quality after this. Something had been offered that was not glass. "Every morning I see that smoke," Nathan said, "and I think about what it means. That someone is down here warm and fed and surviving, while the town that turned them out goes about its business convinced they are dead." He paused. "There is something almost like justice in it, not a comfortable kind." Marta took the glass. Nathan became their invisible supply line. He came when he could manage it without pattern, never twice on the same day of the week, never by the same route. He brought flour and salt, and once a small jar of honey that Marta set aside specifically for Arvid when the cough required something to coat his throat. He never came inside the dugout. He stood at the entrance and passed things through, and they talked for whatever time could be spared, and then he was gone. On his 4th visit, he told her something that changed the shape of her understanding. Rowena, he said, had approached Hector Drummond 6 weeks earlier with a financial offer. She wanted Marta and Eric found and removed from land she considered hers. Hector had refused. Marta started to say something that would have been about Hector's conscience, but Nathan shook his head. "He refused because he wants to find you himself," Nathan said. "He has sent 3 search parties. He has walked that hillside personally. He has told the town you are dead. He said it publicly, and he said it with certainty, and now finding you has become about whether Hector Drummond can be wrong. He cannot tolerate the possibility that he cannot be." Marta was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "So Rowena is looking for another way," she said. Nathan nodded. "I do not know yet what she has found, but she has not stopped." Old Astrid Lundqvist came on a Thursday in early December, and she needed no directions. She was 78 years old, the last Swede in the territory besides Arvid, and she had seen the smoke from the hillside and known immediately what it meant in a way that no one else in Ridgewood had the reference to know. She walked the mile from her small house on the edge of town without telling anyone where she was going, found the entrance without difficulty, and stood before it with tears moving silently down her weathered face. "Jord Keller," she said barely above a whisper. She said it the way you say the name of someone you thought was gone. She came in and sat with Arvid for 2 hours. They talked in Swedish, the old regional dialect from Dalarna, that Marta understood imperfectly, speaking about people long dead in places that existed now only in memory. When she left, she had given them woven blankets and a quantity of bear grease for waterproofing the entrance passage, and something less tangible but more sustaining, the confirmation that what they were doing was not madness, but memory, that they were not inventing something desperate, but recovering something old. Doc Franklin Holt came once on a gray afternoon in mid-December, and he came with the studied casualness of a man pretending he happened to be passing. He was the town's physician, quiet and observant, in the way of people who spend their professional lives reading what others try to hide, and he said very little but watched everything. He examined Arvid without being asked, with the practiced efficiency of someone who already knows most of what the examination will tell him. He left a small quantity of medicine without naming a price. Where he went, he found a moment with Marta out of Arvid's hearing. "The old man has months, not years," he said. "The lung damage is what it is, and there is no remedy for it. What I can do is help manage the discomfort." He looked at her steadily. "You should know." She did know. She said so. He nodded and was quiet for a moment. "I have been watching that smoke all winter," he said then. "From my window in the morning when I am making coffee. Everyone in town laughs about it. But I have been watching it and thinking about what it means that it is still there every morning, that it has not stopped." He left without saying anything further, but he had said enough. What he had not told her, what she would learn only later, was that Hector Drummond had mentioned the search parties in the doc's presence on 3 separate occasions, and that on each occasion, Doc Holt had mentioned a patient requiring urgent attention or a supply issue requiring immediate address, and that these diversions, calculated to cost the searches time and momentum, had been entirely deliberate. He had his own way of helping. It was quieter than Nathan's way, and it left no evidence, which was perhaps more useful. December turned to January. The temperature outside dropped to ranges that made the cold of November seem like consideration rather than hostility. 30 below on the worst nights, 40 below on the worst of the worst. The people of Ridgewood burned through their fuel reserves at a rate that would cause problems before spring, though no one was saying so publicly yet. Inside the dugout, Marta worked in her cotton dress. She had not planned this detail as a statement of any kind. It was simply the practical reality of a space that maintained its temperature, with the indifference of geology, unimpressed by what the air above it was doing. She thought about the men who had searched for her fingers, white inside their gloves, noses running from cold, that got into you regardless of how you dressed against it, and she felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite pity, but existed somewhere in that territory. On the last day of October, before the hardest cold came, Hector Drummond had organized the largest search. 12 men, himself included, riding out to the eastern slope with horses and shovels in the stated intention of locating the Voss children for their own safety. The stated intention being, Marta had understood clearly, a covering story for an operation whose actual purpose was the rescue of Hector Drummond's public certainty. They had come close, closer than any search before. One of the men had stood on the roof of the main chamber for nearly 5 minutes, calling out into the cold air, and Marta had lain on her back in the dim warmth and listened to the sound of his boots directly above her head, and breathed in controlled measures the way Arvid had taught her to breathe. When the body wants to do something, the mind needs to override. It was during this search that she had first noticed something about Hector Drummond's voice as it filtered through the earth. She had expected the voice of a man confirming what he already knew. What she heard instead was a man working very hard to sound like that man. The cadence of certainty was there, but something underneath it was effortful in a way that certainty, the real kind, never is. Eric had heard it too. They talked about it that night by the stove quietly with Arvid, asleep on his platform. "He is not sure anymore," Eric said. No, Marta agreed. Eric was quiet for a moment. "Then what does he do when he finds out he has been wrong?" Marta looked at the fire. She did not have an answer. It was a Tuesday in the last week of January when everything changed. Nathan arrived in the afternoon, moving faster than his usual careful pace, and when Marta saw his face, she knew before he spoke that something had shifted in the landscape of danger around them. "There is a man in Ridgewood," Nathan said. He arrived 4 days ago. His name is Wade Creel. He is a bounty hunter who works the territories between Montana and the Dakotas. Marta felt the cold that the dugout never permitted settle into her chest anyway. Rowena hired him, she said. It was not a question. Nathan nodded. He has not spoken to anyone at length. He does not ask questions at the saloon or the general store. He watches. He has been watching for 4 days, and I do not know what he has seen. What does he look like? Nathan described him lean, a specific stillness about the way he held himself, eyes the color of river water in February. A man who had learned to be unnoticeable in the way that things which are genuinely dangerous sometimes are. Marta thought about the routes Nathan used to reach them. She thought about whether any of those routes had been observed. Has he seen you? She asked. I do not know, Nathan said. I have tried to be careful, but I do not know. After he left, Marta sat with this new information, the way you sit with a structural problem, turning it to see where the weakness was. Wade Creel was not Vernon Calder, who came looking for what he expected to find and found nothing because he lacked imagination. A man who tracked people for a living would not look for structures. He would look for patterns, routes, the negative space around what was hidden. She told Arvid that evening. The old man received the information without visible alarm, which Marta had come to understand was not the same as receiving it without weight. He was quiet for a time, watching the small stove. Then he said, Does he know about Nathan? We do not know, Marta said. Arvid nodded slowly. Then the question is whether Nathan was followed. And that is a question we cannot answer from down here. He coughed once with the wet sound that had become the measure of how the weeks were passing. He looked at the ceiling, which was earth and timber and 14 feet of frozen ground, and his expression was the expression of a man doing a calculation that involves variables he cannot fully control. The boy has been careful, Arvid said finally, but careful is not the same as invisible. 3 days later, Nathan came back. He did not look panicked. Nathan was not a person given to panic, which Marta had come to understand was the result not of temperament, but of having grown up in a house where visible emotion was treated as a form of weakness, and had therefore learned to carry everything internally until he had decided what to do with it. But there was something in the set of his jaw that told her the news was not good before he spoke a word. He followed me, Nathan said. 12 days ago, I did not see him. I was certain I had chosen a clean route, and he followed me anyway, and I did not see him until I happened to look back from the ridge and caught his shape against the sky before he dropped below the line. Marta felt something specific happen in her chest. Not fear exactly, but the sensation of a structure she had built meeting a load it had not been designed for. He knows where the entrance is, she asked. Nathan looked at her steadily. He knows where I go. He knows the fold in the rocks. Whether he has identified the actual entrance, I cannot say for certain. But he knows enough. Marta walked to the far end of the chamber and stood with her back to the others for a moment, her hand against the packed earth wall, feeling the steady, cool temperature of it, the indifferent permanence. She was not falling apart. She was doing what she had learned to do when the situation demanded it, holding herself very still on the outside while the interior worked through the problem at speed. Eric said from where he was sitting, What do we do? Marta turned. She looked at her brother, then at Nathan, then at Arvid on his platform. Arvid spoke before she could. His voice was quiet and entirely certain, which was different from Hector Drummond's certainty in every way that mattered. Where Hector's certainty pushed outward and demanded witnesses, Arvid's certainty sat in the center of itself and required nothing from anyone. We do nothing different, Arvid said. We wait. He looked at Marta. The storm is coming. I feel it in a way I have not felt weather in 50 years. It is close. Days, not weeks. Marta said, and if they come before the storm does. Arvid had met her eyes. Then we will have to make choices we would rather not make. But they will not come before the storm. The storm will not wait for Rowena's schedule. That night, Nathan was gone and Arvid was asleep, and Eric was at the table working on something with his hands, a small carving he had been shaping for several days from a piece of cottonwood. The stove ticked quietly in the corner. Garm lay with his head on Marta's knee, his weight against her leg, a steady and uncomplicated comfort. She thought about what Nathan had said about Wade Creel, a man who tracked people for a living who had found fugitives through blizzards and across rivers. who had presumably followed Nathan with the unhurried patience of someone who had learned that patience was the primary instrument of his work. She thought about Rowena sitting in the homestead that had once belonged to their family, waiting for word from a man she had hired to solve a problem she had not been able to solve herself. She thought about the forged signature on the document, the way it had crawled across the page in the hand of a man who had not known what he was signing or had not known anything at all. She had not cried for her father. She had not had the space for it, the grief kept at a distance by the immediate demands of survival, packed away like something valuable that you intend to return to when you have the time to do it properly. In the quiet of the dugout, she felt it approaching now, that deferred grief, like weather coming in from the north. She let it come for a little while. Garm pressed his head more firmly against her knee, as if he could feel the change in her. Then she packed it away again. There would be time. She hoped there would be time. Outside, the sky over Montana was doing something that no one in Ridgewood was paying attention to. The stars in the north had disappeared behind a bank of cloud that was moving south with a speed and density that would have concerned Arvid deeply if he had been awake to see it. The temperature, which had been a manageable 15 below, had begun to drop again. In Ridgewood, Rowena sat in the parlor of the homestead she had taken and looked at the message from Wade Creel that had arrived that afternoon. He knew where the entrance was. He could lead them to it within the hour. He was ready when she was. She wrote back, "Not yet. I want the whole town to see. A few more days. I want witnesses." She folded the note and set it aside with the satisfaction of someone who believes they are about to close the final chapter of a story they have been writing for months. She did not look out the north window. If she had, she might have seen the color the sky had turned above the ridge. Not black, not gray, but a particular yellow that has no business being in a winter sky. A color that Arvid, lying in his sleeping platform 14 feet below the frozen hillside, had seen in his dreams 3 nights running. He opened his eyes in the dark of the chamber and listened to the silence above him. Soon he said quietly to no one. The stove ticked. The storm did not announce itself the way smaller storms do. There was no gradual darkening, no slow gathering of clouds that gave a man time to finish what he was doing and get inside. 1 hour the sky was pale winter blue with reasonable visibility to the north ridge. The next hour that ridge was gone, swallowed by a wall of white that moved across the land with the indifference of something that does not recognize the difference between a building and a blade of grass. Rowena's party had ridden out that morning in good weather. 15 people horses steaming in the cold but manageable cold. The kind of cold that Montana in late February produces as a matter of routine rather than intention. Wade Creel rode at the front, moving with the economy of a man who has done difficult things long enough that they no longer require visible effort. Hector Drummond rode 3 positions back, dressed in his good coat, his expression carrying the particular quality of a man who has been waiting for a specific moment and believes it is finally arriving. Vernon Calder came because the thing that had outwitted his professional eye for 4 months was about to be revealed and he needed to see it. Boyd Reardon came because he had bet money on Marta's death and had recently begun to wonder if he had been mistaken, and he needed that question settled. Doc Holt had come too at the back of the group for reasons he had not stated to anyone. They were 20 feet from the entrance when the temperature dropped 12 degrees in the span of a single minute. Wade Creel felt it first. He had been in conditions that produced this sensation once before in the Dakota Territory, 10 years earlier, and what he had learned from that experience was a single piece of information he carried ever since: when the temperature moves that fast, the only correct response is immediate movement in the opposite direction. He did not explain this to anyone. He turned his horse and rode, and the horse, smelling what was coming, needed no encouragement. The wall of white hit them before half the group had processed what was happening. It was not snow falling. It was snow being driven horizontally at a velocity that removed the distinction between air and ground, between up and down, between the direction you came from and any other direction. The temperature dropped another 20 degrees in the time it took Vernon Calder to dismount and remount. Boyd Reardon's horse bolted south and he went with it, which turned out to be the decision that saved his life. Several members of the party made it back to their horses and trusted the animals to find Ridgewood by instinct, which was the correct approach, because human navigation in those conditions was not navigation at all, but guessing. Wade Cruill was found 3 days later in a creek bed half a mile from the hillside alive, but with two fingers that would never fully recover from what the cold had done to them. He did not return to Ridgewood after that. Hector Drummond's horse threw him in the first minute of the storm and disappeared into the white. He was on his feet in the snow, disoriented, unable to see anything in any direction, with the wind taking his breath back into his throat before he could fully exhale. Doc Holt found him by nearly riding over him, pulled him up behind the saddle, and let the horse make every subsequent decision. Inside the dugout, Arvid opened his eyes. Marta had been awake already. She had felt the pressure change in the way that several months of living underground had taught her to feel it, the earth itself registering the atmospheric shift before any instrument above ground could measure it. She was at the stove when Arvid spoke. "It is here," he said. She already knew. The storm lasted 9 days. In those 9 days, Ridgewood died and was reborn in a sequence that the survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe accurately and failing, because the experience existed in a register that language approaches, but does not fully reach. By the second day, 3 homes had lost their roofs. The structures that had been built quickly with green timber and insufficient bracing went first. By the third day, the general store's roof came down under the weight of accumulated snow, taking most of Hector Drummond's inventory into a compressed ruin of boards and goods that would not be fully excavated until April. By the 5th day, people were burning furniture to maintain survivable temperatures in buildings that had never been designed to be tested this way, and livestock were dying in barns that had become cold storage rather than shelter. The wind on the worst nights reached speeds that made the buildings that were still standing shudder in a way that was audible from the inside, a deep structural groan that people who lived through it would still hear in their sleep 20 years later. 17 people died in the first 6 days, frozen in structures that ran out of heat, lost between buildings in conditions where 10 feet of visibility was optimistic. One man crushed when a roof came down while he was retrieving fuel from a storage shed. The deaths were not dramatic. They were quiet in the particular way of cold, which takes people not with violence, but with a gradual dimming like a lamp running out of oil. On the 6th day, the wind dropped enough for a window to be useful, and Hector Drummond stood at Doc Holt's window and looked east toward the hillside. The smoke was still there. He stood looking at it for a long time without speaking. The thread of gray barely visible at this distance against the white sky rising with the same steady indifference it had maintained all winter. He had lost his store. His home was standing, but only barely, the walls showing stress fractures he had not seen before the storm. The $3,000 in inventory under the collapsed roof represented the work of a decade. His certainty, the unshakable conviction that had defined how he moved through the world since his 40s, lay somewhere under that rubble alongside everything else. The smoke rose. He thought about the morning he had stood behind his counter and told the whole store that those children would not see November. He thought about the way he had said it, the performance of it, and he understood now what Eric had understood on the road out of town. He had been afraid, not of 2 children, but of the thing they represented, a kind of knowledge that existed outside the system of value he had spent his life constructing, a competence that his money and his position and his certainty could not purchase or replicate or dismiss through ridicule. He had ridiculed it anyway because ridicule was the tool available to him. Doc Holt appeared beside him at the window. Both men looked at the smoke without speaking for a while. "She is going to open the door," Doc Holt said. "When we come to her, she is going to open it." Hector said nothing. "You do not know that," he said finally. The doctor looked at him briefly. "I know what kind of person builds what she built and why." He paused. "You would know too if you had looked at her instead of past her." Below the hillside in the earth, the 9 days had their own texture. Arvid slept more than he had before the storm, which Marta understood as a kind of preparation, the body organizing its remaining resources for what was coming. When he was awake, he was fully present, more present in some ways than he had been in months, with the particular clarity that sometimes appears in people near the end, as if the approaching boundary makes everything on this side of it more vivid. On the second night, he told Marta about Britta. He had never spoken of his wife to her directly. Britta had been dead for 40 years, and the grief of 40 years old is not the raw thing it begins as, but something more like the grain in old wood structural, inseparable from the shape of the person it runs through. He talked for 2 hours in a mixture of Swedish and English, telling her about a woman she had never met through the details that a man remembers when he has been carrying them alone for 4 decades, the specific way Britta laughed at her own jokes before she had finished telling them, the smell of the bread she made on Saturdays, the argument they had in the winter of 1843 that he had never won and never quite let go of. Marta sat and listened without prompting and without direction, and for the first time since September, she was not the person who had to know what to do next. She was simply a young woman listening to an old man tell her about love, and the simplicity of this was something she had not known she needed until she was in the middle of it. On the fourth day, Eric did something that Marta would remember for the rest of her life. He rose before dawn, took one of the candles, and began drawing on the wall of the chamber. Not randomly, but with the focused precision she recognized as his deepest mode of engagement with the world, the way he went somewhere interior and produced something exterior with his hands. He drew the full technical design of the dugout, every dimension, every angle, every structural decision he had made or modified from Arvid's original plans. He drew it to scale precisely using a burnt stick and then a piece of charcoal he had kept in his kit. Arvid woke while he was drawing and watched from his platform without speaking. When Eric finished, he stepped back and looked at it the way you look at something you are committing to memory. Then he turned and saw Arvid watching. Arvid said, "You will build these for other people, not this one for us, others, for people you have never met who will need them." Eric looked at his grandfather for a long moment. He said, "I know." It was the most certain Marta had ever heard her brother sound about anything. On the sixth night after the wind had moderated enough to hear individual sounds again, Marta climbed to the small observation gap near the entrance and looked out toward Ridgewood. What she saw, or more accurately, what she did not see, told her enough. No lights. The darkness where the town should have been was not the ordinary darkness of a cold night, but the darkness of a place that had run out of the resources to push back against it. She climbed back down and sat with Arvid. "If they come here," she said, "the people who turned us out, what do I do?" Arvid was quiet in the way that indicated he was not deciding, but waiting for her to reach what she already knew. She said, "Eric thinks I should let them suffer what they gave us." Arvid said nothing. She said, "Part of me agrees with him." Arvid turned his head and looked at her with the directness that his generation of Swede deployed rarely and meant absolutely. "Then that part of you has never built anything that lasted," he said. "You cannot build with one hand and hold a grudge with the other. The weight is wrong." He closed his eyes. "Your father helped every neighbor who came to him, and he never asked whether they deserved it first. He said it was not his job to decide that. He said his job was to help, and God's job was to sort the rest." Marta looked at the stove, at the small, steady fire that had burned through 9 days of the worst weather in a generation. She said, "I am not sure I believe in God the way Father did." Arvid said without opening his eyes, "You do not have to. You just have to decide what kind of person you intend to be. The rest follows." On the 10th morning, the storm broke. It did not end gradually. It stopped the way it had started, with abruptness, as if whatever force had been driving it had simply finished with this particular stretch of land and moved on. The wind dropped to nothing. The sky cleared to a blue so sharp and clean, it looked like something that had been recently replaced. The sun came up over the eastern ridge and hit the snow in a way that made the world almost too bright to look at directly. Marta and Eric went up first. They stood at the entrance for a moment, both of them blinking in the sudden brightness, and then they looked at what the 9 days had done. The drifts were chest-high in some places and over a man's head in others. The landscape had been sculpted into shapes that bore no relationship to the familiar geography of the hill, every familiar reference point buried or relocated by the wind. It was like standing in a place that had recently been invented. Garm pushed between them and stood in the snow with his nose working, reading whatever the wind was carrying with the complete attention of an animal for whom the world is primarily information. The first thing Marta noticed about Ridgewood, visible in the distance across the white plain, was the skyline. It was wrong. The shapes that should have been there were not there, and the shapes that were there were smaller and lower and less organized than they should have been. She had expected damage. She had not expected the scale of what the town silhouette told her from a mile away. She said to Eric, "We need to go to them." Eric looked at his sister for a long moment. His expression was not the blank stoniness of the boy who had stood at his father's grave. Something had changed in him over these months in ways that neither of them had tracked consciously, the way growth in living things is not visible in any single moment, but is undeniable across time. He said, "I know." They spent the morning moving through the drifts to Ridgewood, and what they found was a town that had lost a third of its buildings and a fifth of its people. The survivors were gathered in the structures that remained, sharing fuel and food with the practical intimacy of people who have understood too late and at high cost that they needed each other. It was Doc Holt who told them the count. 33 survivors from a town that had held nearly 100 souls, 17 dead in the storm, others unaccounted for in outlying homesteads. Marta listened to this and thought about the space inside the dugout, 14 by 22 feet of steady warmth, and what it could hold and what it could not hold, and what the difference between those things would mean. She said, "Tell them where we are, all of them. Tell them to come." Doc Holt looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man confirming something he had already decided to believe. Then he went. They came in the afternoon, following Nathan through the drifts, a line of 33 people moving through chest-high snow toward a hillside most of them had searched and mocked and dismissed. It took 4 hours to cover the distance. The strong took turns breaking the path. Children rode on their parents' backs. The old were supported by whoever was nearest. Hector Drummond fell halfway. His knees had been damaged by the cold he had taken during the storm's first minutes, and they simply stopped cooperating in the middle of a drift. He went down and stayed down for a moment, and the line moved around him with the single-minded momentum of people who had too little left to spare for detours. The hand that came down to him was small. Rose Calder was 6 years old and had not spoken a voluntary word since the storm began. The shock of it having temporarily closed something in her that her parents could not find the key to. She had been carried this far on her father's back and had climbed down at some point in the last quarter mile and was walking on her own, and now she was standing in front of Hector Drummond with her small, mittened hand extended. He looked at that hand for a long moment. Then he took it, and she helped pull him upright with a seriousness and strength that was entirely disproportionate to her size, and they walked the rest of the way together. Marta was standing at the entrance when they came around the fold in the rocks. She had known they were coming for 20 minutes, Garm having shifted from sleep to attention with the quiet precision of an instrument registering a change in conditions. She had stood up from what she was doing and gone to the entrance and waited, and she had used those 20 minutes to decide what she was going to do and make peace with the decision before she had to execute it. Eric stood behind her. He said, "Close the door. Let them feel what they gave us." She heard the old grief in this, the grief of a boy who had lost his father in his home and everything his father had built in the span of 10 days, and then been forced to survive a winter underground, while the people responsible for his situation went about their comfortable lives above him. She heard it and she did not dismiss it. It was a legitimate grief and a legitimate anger, and the impulse it generated was the most human thing in the world. She did not close the door. Hector Drummond came to the front of the group when he saw her standing there. He moved through the people around him with a deliberateness that cost him something, because his knees were damaged and the snow was deep, and the man who arrived before her was not the man who had stood behind his counter in September. That man had been solid in the specific way of someone who has never been significantly tested. This man had been tested and had come apart and was standing in the pieces of himself, which is a different and more honest kind of solidity. He did not make a speech. He took off his hat and held it in both hands and looked at her directly, and he said, "I called you an animal. I said you were digging your own grave. I brought men to find you and drive you out. And while the storm was taking everything I had built in 30 years, piece by piece, night by night, I stood at a window and watched your smoke and understood what it meant. He stopped. There are children here. There are people who will die before tomorrow if they do not find shelter. I am not asking for myself. I gave up the right to ask for myself the day I stood in my store and performed for an audience while two children asked for basic human decency, and I made a joke of it. He met her eyes and did not look away. I am asking for them. Marta looked at the faces behind him. Martha Prescott, who had spread the rumors on the boardwalk. Vernon Calder, who had called this place a grave. Boyd Reardon, who had bet money on her death and was standing now in the back of the group, holding his youngest child against his chest, with both arms, the bravado entirely gone from his face, replaced by something much older and much simpler. Reverend Samuel Aldrich, who had told her to submit to authority and quoted scripture at a girl whose father had just been robbed of his dying signature. And the children. Rose Calder, with her small hand still slightly extended from when she had pulled Hector Drummond from the drift. The Brannigan twins, barely old enough to remember this when they were grown. A dozen other small faces that had committed no offense against her and whose parents' failures were not their inheritance. She stepped back from the entrance. "Come in," she said, "all of you." What happened in the 14 days that followed was not the story anyone in Ridgewood had expected to be part of. The dugout held 33 people in a space built for 3, and this should not have worked, and in most of the ways that can be measured, it did not. There was not enough room to lie down properly. There was not enough food, and Marta gave what there was without counting it. The air grew thick with the breath and warmth of too many bodies in a small space, and this turned out to be less of a problem than anticipated. Because too many bodies in a small space also produces heat, and heat was what they needed. Marta organized it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been managing a contained environment for 5 months and understood its tolerances. Children nearest the stove, elderly given the best sleeping positions, able-bodied adults taking shifts on every task firewater, from melted snow, watching the entrance for structural concerns, checking on the weaker members. She did not ask for help. She assigned it, and people accepted the assignments because there was no viable alternative, and because something about the way she gave instructions communicated that she had thought about this more carefully than they had. The change in Rose Calder came on the 3rd day. Garm had been watching the child since she arrived with the calibrated attention he gave to anything he was trying to understand. On the morning of the 3rd May, he crossed the chamber and lay down beside her with his large head on her knee, and the directness of the gesture, its complete absence of calculation, seemed to reach something in the child that the careful approaches of adults had not been able to find. She looked down at him for a long moment. "Can I pet the dog?" she asked. Her voice was the voice of a child who has been away somewhere and is checking whether the ordinary rules still apply. "His name is Garm," Marta said, "and he has been waiting for someone who needed him." Rose's hand moved slowly to the gray fur. Garm's tail thumped against the packed earth once, twice, 3 times. Her mother turned away. Her father did not trust himself to speak. Something in the room shifted, not dramatically, but genuinely the way a room shifts when a window is open, and the air that comes in is not the same air that was already there. On the 5th night, Hector Drummond moved to sit beside Marta at the stove. He did not ask permission. He simply sat with the deliberate movements of a man whose body had been reminded of its limits, and for a while he said nothing. "Then your grandfather, what was he like?" Marta looked at him for a moment, measuring the question. Then she told him. She talked about Arvid for an hour, about Dalarna, and the iron mines, and the ocean crossing, and the argument with Lars about how to build, and the 40 years alone in the small cabin, and the knowledge he had carried all that time, without anyone asking him to share it. Hector listened without speaking, without the posture of a man waiting for his turn to talk, just listening the way you listen when you finally understand that you have been doing most of the talking for too long. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I have spent 30 years deciding what things were worth before I understood them. Livestock, land, lumber, people. Everything had a value and I assigned it, and that was the end of the discussion." He looked at the stove. "You came into my store and I assigned your value in about 30 seconds, and I was wrong in every direction. Marta said nothing. He said, why did you let us in? She had thought about how to answer this. She said, because my father would have. Because turning you away would have made me the thing you already believed I was. And because those children outside in the snow had not done anything to me, and I was not willing to make them pay for their parents. Hector nodded. He looked at the fire for a long time. Then he said, that is grace. Marta said, that is what Arvid would call it. I just call it doing what has to be done. On the 11th night, Arvid called her. His voice from the sleeping platform was not weak exactly, but it had a quality of finality that she had been preparing herself to hear, and found herself unprepared for anyway. She crossed the room and sat beside him and took his hand. He said in Swedish, Britta is calling. I can hear her very clearly now. She did not tell him he was imagining it. She said, what does she sound like? He smiled, exactly like herself, exactly as I remember. He turned his head to look at her in the dim light. You are everything your father hoped for, and everything I hoped for, and everything your mother prayed for on that ship before the sea took her. He squeezed her hand with what strength he had. I need you to promise me something. She said, I know what you are going to ask. He said, promise me anyway. She said, I will teach everyone who wants to learn. I will not let it be forgotten. Arvid closed his eyes. Good, he said, good. Eric came and took the other hand without being asked. He sat on the other side of his grandfather and held on, and the three of them were still for a long time while the stove ticked, and the 30 other people in the chamber breathed and slept around them. Arvid said, almost inaudibly, Lars. He said it like a greeting. Then he was gone. The chamber was silent. No one who had been awake and witnessed it spoke. There was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying. Eric sat for a long time holding his grandfather's hand. Then he rose, took the piece of charcoal from his kit, and went to the wall where his technical drawings had been since the 4th day of the storm. He stood before them and traced one line, not adding anything, not changing anything, just following the line he had drawn with his fingertip. It was the only goodbye he needed to make. The snow began melting in the 2nd week of March. They found Rowena 3 days after the thaw began to reveal what the storm had buried. She was 30 feet from the entrance. She had been running in what she believed was the direction of safety and the wind, and the white had turned her until she was running toward the thing she had been trying to destroy, and she had reached 30 feet from warmth and light and survival without knowing it was there. Marta stood over the place where they had uncovered her and felt something she could not immediately name, a compound thing. Not grief exactly, and not satisfaction, and not forgiveness. Something that was perhaps the absence of all three. The simplest thing she could find in herself to say was what she said. She was a person. She said it quietly to Eric beside her. A terrible person who did terrible things. But she was a person. Eric looked at the frozen ground. He did not spit. He said nothing. After a moment, he walked back toward town. Marta stood there alone for a moment longer. Then she went to do what needed to be done. Ridgewood rebuilt. Not immediately and not easily, and not into the same shape it had been before. The storm had removed certain things permanently, not just structures, but arrangements. The unexamined certainties about who was worth listening to and who was not, about what kinds of knowledge mattered and what kinds could be laughed at. These things did not return with the warm weather. Hector Drummond never reclaimed his position as the town's leading voice. He did not try. He spent the rest of his long life doing something no one who had known him before the storm would have predicted. He listened. He listened to newcomers who arrived in Ridgewood uncertain about the land and the weather and the winter. He took them to see the dugout on the eastern slope, still maintained, still warm, and he told them the story of the smoke from nowhere with the particular credibility of a man describing his own failure. He began every telling the same way. I was the man who said they would not survive until November. I was wrong in every possible way a man can be wrong. And this is what my wrongness cost. And this is what the people I was wrong about built. And this is what they did with it when I came to them with nothing left. Vernon Calder and Eric Voss built 5 underground shelters in the hills around Ridgewood before the following winter. They worked without hierarchy, the experienced builder, and the boy who had spent 5 months underground, each knowing things the other did not. and trading that knowledge back and forth until the line between teacher and student became meaningless. Eric never charged for his work. He said he was repaying something that could not be repaid through any other currency. The technique spread. Survivors from Ridgewood carried it to neighboring settlements, and those settlements carried it further, and within 5 years there were underground shelters in a 100-mile radius around that eastern slope. And within 10 years, the phrase smoke from nowhere had entered the common language of the Montana Territory. It came to mean any preparation that looks like madness until it is the only thing between you and destruction. Any knowledge that seems useless until the moment when it is the only knowledge that matters. Nathan Aldrich and Marta Voss were married in the spring of 1886 in a ceremony held at the entrance to the dugout because there was no other location that meant what that entrance meant. Reverend Samuel Aldrich performed the ceremony with a humility that had not been visible in him before the storm, and that his son had never expected to see. He spoke not about authority or submission, but about shelter, about what it means to provide it and what it means to accept it, and whether he was preaching to his congregation or to himself was perhaps not a question with a clean answer. Arvid was buried on the hillside above the entrance, and the headstone Eric carved read, "He taught us how to disappear. We learned how to survive." In the years that followed, the dugout became many things in sequence. A landmark, then a legend, then a place people made a point of visiting when they passed through that part of Montana. In 1978, researchers from the university documented it with instruments and measurements and published papers about passive solar design principles that the structure had embodied without anyone using those words. They called it remarkable. They called it ahead of its time. They did not understand that it was not ahead of its time. It was simply older than the time they were measuring from. Marta Voss lived to be 89 years old. She outlived Nathan by 7 years and her brother by 3, and she watched the world transform around her in ways that Arvid had not imagined, and Lars would not have recognized automobiles and airplanes and electric lights and 2 world wars and everything that came after. Through all of it, she rose before dawn in the winter to tend the fire. Through all of it, she taught anyone who wanted to learn. On the last morning of her life, in the spring of 1957, she asked her granddaughter to help her outside. She wanted to see the smoke one more time, she said. She wanted to see it in the morning light. They sat on the porch together, the old woman and the young one, and the sun came up over the eastern ridge and painted everything in shades that did not have clean names. From the hillside, because the dugout was still maintained and still heated in the cold months, the smoke rose. The same thin gray thread it had always been. The smoke from nowhere. Marta looked at it for a long time. "Do you see it?" she asked. Her granddaughter said she did. "That is not smoke from nowhere," Marta said. "That is every person who kept a fire burning when someone told them the fire was not worth keeping. That is your great-great-grandfather Arvid, who carried knowledge for 50 years waiting for someone willing to learn it. That is your great-uncle Eric, who drew the design on a dirt wall so it would not be forgotten. That is everyone who was afraid and built anyway." She was quiet for a moment, her eyes on the smoke. "The storm always comes," she said. "It always does. The question is never whether it will come. The question is what you built before it arrived and who you decide to be when it does." Her granddaughter held her hand. The smoke rose. Some stories end with the satisfaction of revenge, with the wrongdoers punished, and the wronged elevated, and justice delivered with the clean efficiency of a closing argument. This is not that story. This story ends with a door opening, with a 17-year-old girl who had every reason to close it standing aside, with 33 people walking into warmth they had not earned and being given it anyway, not because they deserved it, but because the person who had every right to refuse had decided that what she built with her hands was not going to be diminished by becoming a weapon. The smoke still rises from that hillside if you know where to look. The dugout still stands more than a century after 2 young people and an old man carved it from frozen ground with their hands and their knowledge, and the stubborn insistence that preparation is not pessimism, but love. And somewhere in that steady thread of gray against the Montana sky is the answer to every question anyone ever asked about what a person is worth and what a person owes and what it means to survive something and then decide what to do with the surviving. The smoke rises. Someone is keeping the fire.